I mean, even with this announcement, so this is £5 billion of savings a year by the end of the decade. The reports coming out of the Treasury are that because Rachel Reeves says there are not going to be any tax rises, there are still going to be some pretty swinging cuts to government departments, up to 7% in some of the protected government departments. And that people are increasingly saying inside the government, look, if it looks and sounds and feels like austerity, it is austerity, despite the promise that the Labour government was going to end austerity. What sort of shape do you think Rachel Reeves is in and the government's in coming into next week's statement, which, yes, was supposed to be just an OBR forecast, which the law requires the OBR to do twice a year, and the Chancellor to present to Parliament, but is increasingly looking like, of course, a budget?
Well, we said last autumn that the cuts in public spending, which were implied by the budget settlement for public spending, would mean austerity-style cuts for departments other than health and defence. And I think that was clear at the time of the election as well. And if, in order to keep on track for the fiscal rules, at a time when growth looks like it's weaker and the world economy is weaker, that the way to keep on course with fiscal rules is to go further than public spending cuts, which last autumn looked like austerity. That's going to be a very difficult message for this spring statement and for the summer. And look, over the last year, we have both said repeatedly on this podcast, they should get a mandate pre-election for the scale of what will have to be done on public spending. That wasn't done. We said in the autumn, have a room for manoeuvre. They didn't do that. I said a few weeks ago that she should look right now at whether you need a reset because of the kind of global security challenges. It's clear that that isn't going to happen. So they are going to plough on. I mean, the one thing I have to say, if I was Rachel, I would not be persisting with this mythology. This isn't a budget.
You can call it a spring statement. You don't actually have to call it a budget and get the red box out, do you?
I would say it is now widely called a mini budget everywhere. Because, even if...
it doesn't have a very good history, mini budgets.
No, and actually...
Get Kwasi Kwarteng on one of our Inside the Rooms to explain why.
It would be better to say, that things have changed. I think it would be better to say that the reason why people have told me that I need to have 2 budgets a year alongside the OBR forecast or 2 budget-like events is because the world changes and you have to kind of be able to recalibrate, and doing that twice a year is the right way to go. I think it would be much better if she said, yep, that's right. And my desire to have 1 a year, which the Treasury wanted me to do, was a mistake. And, this is going to be a moment where I set out in my stall. If she simply comes along and says, I'm keeping to my fiscal rules, there's global headwinds, it's nothing to do with me, but I'm going to cut public spending even further, I don't think that is making the most of the opportunity she has. And being positive, if I was Rachel next week, I would think, what is my biggest challenge at the moment? The biggest challenge at the moment is that the economy is still weak and the forecasts for growth are poor, and there is still not yet a galvanising economic story about what the government is going to do based upon a galvanising diagnosis of what they think has gone wrong in the last 10, 15, 20 years. And I would go after this statement, not being a sort of narrow Treasury bean counting, cut public spending moment. I would be go out there and saying, this has got to change. And I would be wanting a big prospectus on the economy. As you know, I think she should be moving on tax and the fiscal rules to stop a spending review, which is going to be impossible to deliver. Put that to one side. She should come out and say, what's happened in our relationship with the European Union has been a disaster. We're going to do something about it.
By the way, did you notice we're cut out of the EU defence fund that they're setting up at the moment? Which I thought would be a route back for Starmer into closer cooperation with the EU.
EU, dynamism in the labour market, competition and competition policy, innovation spend, infrastructure spend. These are all things where it's clear we haven't got things right and we can do better. And that's what I'm about. I would use this as a big economic budget style showcase moment to say to people, we're levelling with you about how hard this is and it's worse than we thought and we're going to sort it out. And that levelling moment is the right time to do some fiscal recalibration. I don't think she's going to do that. But at least go out and do something which looks like it's big and bold and it has a vision rather than narrow and bean counting, because it's not going to work.
No, and you definitely need a response, don't you, to the age of Trump? By which I mean Trump has already imposed tariffs on the UK. The UK didn't retaliate. Now, in the sort of conversation that's being had with the Americans, the British, side is starting to say, look, we're not actually expecting all the tariffs to come off the UK. The Americans have thrown into the mix this thing called the Digital Services Tax, which is essentially the tax that Britain levies on companies like Google and Amazon. And that raises a handy £800 million a year for the Treasury. So that's not an easy thing to give up at the moment like this. And you could definitely lean into, we have to start to change the British economy. And it's a big challenge, but there's also opportunity. Look at the defence spending we're going to be bringing on tap. Let's make sure it goes into innovation, new startup companies in defence. Let's make sure it's not entirely reliant on American contracts. And so there is an interest. I agree there's a story you could tell, but let's be honest, it's against a pretty tough backdrop. And we're doing this podcast on a day when the Bank of England hasn't cut interest rates, and interest rates, despite the economy being flat, are still pretty high because of risks of inflation, both here at home and risks of inflation imported from the tariff policy of Trump. I agree with you. You want to try and tell a positive story. I agree with you. There are things you could construct, but you're still, shouting into the wind, aren't you, a bit at the moment?
If you look at the boldness of what Merz has done, the new German Chancellor, kind of ripping up.
Yeah. Totally bouncing out of the box of sort of post-Cold War German politics.
Because he says this is...
As a long time,
Exactly. Because he said...
old-time CDU politician, he suddenly rewrote the rules. Yeah.
Because he says this is what is needed in these difficult and dangerous times. And, whatever you think of Donald Trump, he's certainly kind of breaking out of old constraints. And fundamentally, at the moment, the Rachel Reeves is boxed in by her manifesto and then by the budget, and then what she said she was going to do after the budget. This is the end. I don't need to make any more recalibrations. She's boxed in by what's happening to the economy and the OBR forecast. She's boxed in by kind of difficult challenges in the world, and she has to break out of that. And I do think now is the right time to do it. And even if she doesn't do that in policy terms, which she should, I think to level with people that it's a different world to how she thought it was going to be last summer, and this is my plan, would be better than looking like you are just sort of,
pretending this was what you thought was going to happen all along.
But there's been difficult headwinds, and I'm tough because I'll have bigger public spending cuts than even I thought. I don't think that's the right place for her to be. I'm a better Labour Chancellor than you thought because I'm going to have even bigger public spending cuts. Really?
Philip Snowden.
I know, George Osborne.
Yeah, well,
it's not the path.
Work for me and work for the country.
It's not the path to follow.